Hello, friends from different spaces and different times. I hope this finds you well and healthy. I figured we would continue our adventure, our commitment to read each and every one of the definitions, axioms, and propositions of Spinoza's ethics, and we would continue with two definitions for today, following from the first. But we should remind ourselves of some things that we established that were insightful, I think, for reading the text. Because this text is a text about ethics. It's a text about the highest good, about an ethical life. But we realized in asking that kind of question, how do we get here? What is nature? What is the nature of action? What is the nature of nature? How do things fit together as they were? The world, ourselves in it, animals, insects, these are all various different modes, you might call them, of an expression of nature. And how do they fit together? We need to investigate these things and get clear on them. And this is the task of what's called ontology, or metaphysics. And so, accordingly, the first book of the ethics is on de Deo, of God. And the first definition that we talked about in the last session was on causa sui. We wanted to get clear on what was the most primitive, what was the most essential in terms of its source. And we realized it seems like we have to posit something that's self-caused, something that causes itself, something that entails itself. And so one might think there is a kind of primitiveness in both body, causal affection, and thought, logical or thought of entailment, if you want to put it that way. So causa sui is articulated in the two different ways that we know of things, bodies and thinking. And this is to say, they're both nature, their own distinctive ways of expression, but nevertheless, that's how nature is, caused, self-caused in these two ways. Now, that says a little more than what we need, but I think it gives us a direction, especially for today, about the two definitions that we want to address. The first one being on the definition of a finite thing, and the second one being the definition, well, the third definition, the second one we're dealing with today, that with sorry, with regard to substance. So definition of substance, or what substance is, or in the, I believe, Dutch, it's like Selbstständigkeit or something along those lines. I don't speak Dutch. It just reminds me of the German, or Selbstständigkeit. So like self-standing. So substance, we might think of it as kind of self-standing. And right, the second definition being something of a finite thing, right? I mean, let's say something a little bit more about those two before we read them, which is that it seems like causa sui, if there's such a thing, that wouldn't be a finite thing. You know, when I look at ordinary things like this bird before me, this landscape, myself in my own inner life, those are all delimited in some way, some fundamental way. They're all sort of begin and have an end. Whereas in the case of causa sui, if there is such a thing, it would always exist. It would necessarily exist. It would just, by virtue of either conception or just the very nature of there being a cause, would already cause itself to exist and sort of persist, so to speak, forever or eternally. One might call them body, thought, maybe. I'm not sure. This is all to say that whatever causa sui is, it's definitely not finite in our traditional sense of what finite things are, which are things like the tree before me, or actually, sorry, I meant to say the behind me, or the landscape before me, or the world, right, in general. It lives on continually and keeps going on, but most things die, come to be and pass away. And so those things are not causa sui, assuredly. But of course, Spinoza is not necessarily addressing average, everyday things. He's thinking of the most primitive sense of nature. nature is as such in itself, in its very conception. And of course, that requires something insightful that might be timeless, essentially, something that has insight forever and not just right now I'm judging the light to be dimming as the day goes on this day. And that's a temporary judgment and doesn't have lasting insight. Spinoza thinks that our insight into causa sui wouldn't be of that nature. Um, anyways, uh, another thing that we should remind ourselves of that I just realized is that we should, again, remind ourselves these definitions are the building blocks, right? They're the building blocks for an enterprise. And they're for the enterprise of understanding nature as such, which is why it's necessary to get at the most essential components, things that are timeless and not just temporary. Um, in this respect, he defines finitude essentially. So the second definition, reads, that thing is said to be finite in its own kind. That can be limited by another of the same nature. For example, a body is called finite because we always conceive another that is greater. Thus, a thought is limited by another thought, but a body is not limited by a thought, nor a thought by a body. So, if you read Spinoza before, you would realize it's a kind of a nascent pointing to in the direction of what's called in the literature a parallelism, so that the idea that there's two equivalent orders expressed in two different ways, body, thought. They sort of are the same thing, but expressed in two different ways. So they're like two parallel lines in the same order and structure. That's a controversial thesis, but we'll have to get it in due time to see what the upshot of it is. But you can see how it is already at the outset of definition 2. There's no argument for it thus far. The argument comes later, but it's implied. So again, this idea of finitude, something is finite by which something else can limit it. The Latin is like terminere or like terminate, but of course terminate is not like in the sense of Terminator, some sort of violent sense, but in the sense of like delimitation. So like think about this book. I delimit it with my body or my face. Or the trees behind me, they delimit or terminate me in a certain respect. They outgrow me. Some of these trees might be older than I am and have lived much longer than I have, and maybe live longer than I will ever live. The world, the earth, the universe, these are all greater than me as bodies. But he also says this about thought. Let's think of a thought experiment to think about what this means. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have the natural number set, or the set of all natural numbers. You can always think of a greater natural number. Always. I could sit here and think of 5 billion and then add another 5 billion and I would have something greater. And I can always have something greater. And this is something to say that there are infinities in mathematics. And there are so great infinities that we can never find a complete infinity, an infinity that sort of captures all infinities. It's just the nature of what it means for something to be infinite in mathematics or in thought. So we can always think of something greater. The same thing applies to bodies. We can always think of a greater body just by the very nature of thinking it, but also of sort of encountering it. Who knows? Maybe we'll find another macro universe that encompasses our universe, that encompasses all other, universes. We don't know. It's conceivable. It's totally logically possible. And it seems like what Spinoza is arguing for is that by the very nature of something being finite, it can be limited by another thing. It's delimited. It has a certain determinant surrounding or limitation. And so it's thereby finite. The interesting thing, though, as we said, is that a body cannot limit a thought, right? That's very strange. But it seems like we would intuitively never really compare the two. I would never say that my thought encompasses a body. It seems sort of counterintuitive to make that argument. And Spinoza seems to be sort of arguing for on essential grounds that that's in principle never the case. So it's not just a matter of fact the case, but it can never possibly be the case. It's just by the very definition of something to be a body that if it's finite, it can be delimited by other bodies, and that if it's a thought, it can be delimited by other thoughts insofar as they're finite. Um, Another thing that's interesting is that the idea that thoughts are finite. We never really think about thoughts as kind of delimited, but we can think of it. Let's think of another thought experiment or another exemplary case, actually from history. Let's think of Einstein, great inventor, sort of proposed special relativity, was initially challenged in terms of Newtonian mechanics, or sort of in the sense of that the predominant accepted field when he was sort of proposing his theory was Newtonian mechanics, and they thought Einstein wasn't true until there was a proof of sort of special and general relativity by the proof of the orbit of Mercury. So it was observed experimentally, and so corroborated sort of his theory. Anyways, we can see how a kind of idea, the idea of maybe special and general relativity, as an idea, has all these ripple effects in the field of physics. So once a sort of, there's a kind of normalcy, maybe Newtonian mechanics, like Newtonian mechanics when it was initially proposed, huge, changed the landscape of physics, but then eventually sort of became static and accepted. And then you have this burst of invention by Einstein, who discovered special and general relativity. Oh, sorry, I got excited. But so discovered these physical laws or physical facts about the universe, and there was an explosion of other sort of observations, experiments, and so that idea kind of it encompassed not just like the immediacy of Einstein, but all these other ideas that other people had, and so that idea, in a certain respect, encompasses all these other smaller ideas, right? Insofar as they all presuppose in some fundamental way special and general relativity. And so in that way, thoughts are finite, but they have greater intensities, if you could put it that way. It would be weird to call them like delimited in space, but maybe the word that we want to use is something like an intensity or something of a sort of the intensity of their insight or their sort of conceptual or explanatory power is another way of putting it. Their power to put effects and to show them in the world. Some ideas are just great that way. They have an impact through the sort of history of humanity. And so in that respect, thoughts can delimit other thoughts, ostensibly, maybe. I don't know. That's my best attempt for explaining that. It's very obvious in the case of bodies, but it's very perplexing in the case of thought. Okay, the second definition, sorry, I keep saying second definition. It's the second one we're addressing, but it's the third definition in the book. So the third definition reads, by substance, or something self-standing is another way of putting it, I understand what is in itself, or in se in the Latin, and is conceived through itself, or per se concepitur, that is, that whose concept does not require the concept of another thing, from which it must be formed. So I use the sort of colloquial or the sort of, just layman speech of something self-standing because it gives a clear picture. Something that stands on its own ground, something that independently stands, independent of anything else, something that does not depend on another. That is what substance essentially is. There's a kind of sense in which we've already established this. Causa sui is a kind of self-standing, right? It causes itself. It entails itself. In that respect, it stands on its own ground, so to speak. Or to give a reasoned account of causa sui, you have to appeal to it itself. And so substance is likewise a kind of ontological term to articulate how something can stand on its own ground. So something that stands on its own ground is in se, that is to say, in itself. Two, is conceived through itself. So thinking through it, I don't need to rely on something else. I just think it. And essentially, that means I don't need some concept of another thing in order to form it. I mean, that's all very jargony. How could we put this in more simple terms? I think a simple case is very obvious to us. If you're a scientist, it's very clear. When I go investigate nature, I'm investigating nature. I'm not going to get into the issues of philosophy of science, but it's clear that I'm giving models to explain things. Like I propose a model, it has some explanatory power, and it captures some predictive sort of success through the running of experiments. But what I'm trying to get at is nature as such, in its laws, in its behaviors, in its regularities. I'm not trying to get at some image of nature. I'm just trying to get at nature as such. Nature for the physicist or for the chemist or for the biologist, for the sciences, that's primitive. That is the most essential. That is the what stands on its own ground, which is why we call it a kind of naturalism, right? Naturalism is the ground and effects of laws, of regularities, etc., and chemistry, and sort of DNA replication, etc., like all these various different phenomena. That's in nature as such. It's not God, right? Well, at least for Spinoza, it is God, but God, that is to say, nature, God, Deo, or Deo seu natura. But like a theologian, some sort of divine actor behind the scenes, as it were, sort of acting and sort of producing all these effects. No one appeals to that in science. We just appeal to nature. I can just look at the tree before me and do science essentially on given biological phenomena to understand maybe photosynthesis or how they sort of reproduce, right? Like I don't appeal to something else. That is Selbstständigkeit, or something that stands on its own ground, right? Something that is just in itself, and I don't need a concept of another thing, right? Like I don't rely on some other, like I don't first go to some other model, like okay, this is the model of nature, and then I investigate nature. No, I just directly sort of say, what is nature? Here's what nature is. I mean, this is what it means to think about the primitiveness or the kind of originary source of things, right? So the first definition, which is why we began with causa sui, is to begin of something that causes itself, that where we can give a reasoned account of its own generation because it entails itself. And secondly, in the case of something substantial, is that it stands on its own ground. It's not finite. It's not delimited by something else, because to be delimited by something else means that one would have to require the formation of the conception of that other thing that delimits that thing. But substance and causa sui seem to not be following the same definition as finitude. So we can already see how these definitions sort of interrelate to one another. Causa sui seems to sort of articulate, or let's say it this way, substance as a third definition seems to articulate more of some of the things that were implied in the first case, causa sui, and finitude seems to give some delimitation about what causa sui is not. So causa sui doesn't seem to be something finite, and something that would be substantial, something that stands on its own ground, something that's not delimited by something else. That wouldn't be something finite either. So these definitions already put us kind of in the nascent sort of direction of what we will deduce later and show through the propositions. I think that is all we have for now. Hopefully that clarified some things about these two definitions, and I will see you all later another time, some other time in the future. Have a good one. Stay healthy.